Welcome to a journey through faith and scrutiny with Clive Staples Lewis. In his thought-provoking lecture, Fern Seed and Elephants, also known as Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism, Lewis challenges the contemporary academic approach to biblical texts, highlighting a pivotal conversation with a teacher and referencing Alec Widler's insights. He critiques modern scholars for their lack of historical respect and understanding of sacred scriptures. Lewis identifies two distinct groups of outsiders in religious studies, those who are converted and those who are not, and discusses the potential dangers of modern theological interpretations. He passionately argues for a responsible engagement with biblical texts, urging educators to preserve their true value against modern distortions. Join us as we delve into Lewis's call to uphold the sanctity of Scripture amidst modern challenges, ensuring the true spirit of religious texts is not overshadowed by contemporary misreadings.
31. Fern Seed and Elephants. Originally entitled Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism, Lewis read this essay at Westcott House, Cambridge, on the 11th of May, 1959. Published under that title in Christian Reflections, 1981, it is now in Fern Seed and Elephants, 1998. This paper arose out of a conversation I had with the principal one night last term. A book of Alec Widler's happened to be lying on the table, and I expressed my reaction to the sort of theology it contained. My reaction was a hasty and ignorant one, produced with the freedom that comes after dinner. Note: while the bishop was out of the room, Lewis read The Sign at Cana in Alec Widler's Windsor Sermons. The bishop recalls that when he asked him what he thought about it, Lewis expressed himself very freely about the sermon and said that he thought it was quite incredible that we should have had to wait nearly 2,000 years to be told by a theologian called Widler that what the Church has always regarded as a miracle was, in fact, a parable. One thing led to another, and before we were done I was saying a good deal more than I had meant about the type of thought which, so far as I could gather, is now dominant in many theological colleges. He then said, "I wish you would come and say all this to my young men." He knew, of course, that I was extremely ignorant of the whole thing. But I think his idea was that you ought to know how a certain sort of theology strikes the outsider. Though I may have nothing but misunderstandings to lay before you, you ought to know that such misunderstandings exist. That sort of thing is easy to overlook inside one's own circle. The minds you meet daily have been conditioned by the same studies and prevalent opinions as your own. That may mislead you. For of course, as priests, it is the outsiders you will have to cope with. You exist in the long run for no other purpose. The proper study of shepherds is sheep, not, save accidentally, other shepherds. And woe to you if you do not evangelize. I am not trying to teach my grandmother. I am a sheep, telling shepherds what only a sheep can tell them. And now I start my bleating. There are two sorts of outsiders, the uneducated and those who are educated in some way but not in your way. How you are to deal with the first class, if you hold views like Loisy's or Schweitzer's or Bultmann's or Tillich's, or even Alec Widler's, I simply don't know. I see, and I'm told that you see, that it would hardly do to tell them what you really believe. A theology which denies the historicity of nearly everything in the Gospels, to which Christian life and affections and thought have been fastened for nearly 2 millennia, which either denies the miraculous altogether, or, more strangely, after swallowing the camel of the resurrection, strains at such gnats as the feeding of the multitudes, if offered to the uneducated man, can produce only one or other of two effects. It will make him a Roman Catholic or an atheist. What you offer him he will not recognize as Christianity. If he holds to what he calls Christianity, he will leave a church in which it is no longer taught, and look for one where it is. If he agrees with your version, he will no longer call himself a Christian, and no longer come to church. In his crude, coarse way, he would respect you much more if you did the same. An experienced clergyman told me that most liberal priests, faced with this problem, have recalled from its grave the late medieval conception of two truths: a picture truth which can be preached to the people, and an esoteric truth for use among the clergy. I shouldn't think you will enjoy this conception much when you have to put it into practice. I'm sure if I had to produce picture truths to a parishioner in great anguish or under fierce temptation, and produce them with that seriousness and fervour which his condition demanded, while knowing all the time that I didn't exactly, only in some Pickwickian sense, believe them myself, I'd find my forehead getting red and damp and my collar getting tight. But that is your headache, not mine. You have, after all, a different sort of collar. I claim to belong to the second group of outsiders, educated but not theologically educated. How one member of that group feels I must now try to tell you. The undermining of the old orthodoxy has been mainly the work of divines engaged in New Testament criticism. The authority of experts in that discipline is the authority in deference to whom we are asked to give up a huge mass of beliefs shared in common by the early Church, the Fathers, the Middle Ages, the Reformers, and even the 19th century. I want to explain what it is that makes me sceptical about this authority. Ignorantly sceptical, as you will all too easily see. But the scepticism is the father of the ignorance. It is hard to persevere in a close study when you can work up no prima facie confidence in your teachers. First, then, whatever these men may be as biblical critics, I distrust them as critics. They seem to me to lack literary judgment, to be imperceptive about the very quality of the texts they are reading. It sounds a strange charge to bring against men who have been steeped in those books all their lives. But that might be just the trouble. A man who has spent his youth and manhood in the minute study of New Testament texts and of other people's studies of them, whose literary experience of those texts lacks any standard of comparison, such as can only grow from a wide and deep and genial experience of literature in general, is, I should think, very likely to miss the obvious things about them. If he tells me that something in a gospel is legend or romance, I want to know how many legends and romances he has read, how well his palate is trained in detecting them by the flavour, not how many years he has spent on that gospel. But I had better turn to examples. In what is already a very old commentary, I read that the fourth gospel is regarded by one school as a spiritual romance, a poem, not a history, to be judged by the same canons as Nathan's parable, the Book of Jonah, Paradise Lost, or, more exactly, Pilgrim's Progress. After a man has said that, why need one attend to anything else he says about any book in the world? Note that he regards Pilgrim's Progress, a story which professes to be a dream and flaunts its allegorical nature by every single proper name it uses, as the closest parallel. Note that the whole epic panoply of Milton goes for nothing. But even if we leave out the grosser absurdities and keep to Jonah, the insensitiveness is crass. Jonah, a tale with as few even pretended historical attachments as Job, grotesque in incident and surely not without a distinct, though of course edifying, vein of typically Jewish humour. Then turn to John. Read the dialogues, that with the Samaritan woman at the well, or that which follows the healing of the man born blind. Look at its pictures. Jesus, if I may use the word, doodling with his finger in the dust. The unforgettable, and it was night. John chapter 13, verse 30. I have been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know that not one of them is like this. Of this text there are only two possible views. Either this is reportage, though it may no doubt contain errors, pretty close up to the facts, nearly as close as Boswell. Or else some unknown writer in the 2nd century, without known predecessors or successors, suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern, novelistic, realistic narrative. If it is untrue, it must be narrative of that kind. The reader who doesn't see this has simply not learned to read. I would recommend him to read Auerbach. Here, from Bultmann's Theology of the New Testament, is another. Observe in what unassimilated fashion the prediction of the Parousia, Mark chapter 8, verse 38, follows upon the prediction of the Passion, chapter 8, verse 31. What can he mean? Unassimilated? Bultmann believes that predictions of the Parousia are older than those of the Passion. He therefore wants to believe, and no doubt does believe, that when they occur in the same passage, some discrepancy or unassimilation must be perceptible between them. But surely he foists this on the text with shocking lack of perception. Peter has confessed Jesus to be the Anointed One. That flash of glory is hardly over before the dark prophecy begins, that the Son of Man must suffer and die. Then this contrast is repeated. Peter, raised for a moment by his confession, makes his false step. The crushing rebuff, "Get thee behind me," follows. Then, across that momentary ruin which Peter, as so often, becomes the voice of the Master, turning to the crowd, generalizes the moral. All his followers must take up the cross. This avoidance of suffering, this self-preservation, is not what life is really about. Then, more definitely still, the summons to martyrdom. You must stand to your own tackling. If you disown Christ here and now, he will disown you later. Logically, emotionally, imaginatively, the sequence is perfect. Only a Bultmann could think otherwise. Finally, from the same Bultmann, the personality of Jesus has no importance for the kerygma either of Paul or of John. Indeed, the tradition of the earliest church did not even unconsciously preserve a picture of his personality. Every attempt to reconstruct one remains a play of subjective imagination. So there is no personality of our Lord presented in the New Testament. Through what strange process has this learned German gone in order to make himself blind to what all men except him see? What evidence have we that he would recognize a personality if it were there? For it is Bultmann contra mundum. If anything whatever is common to all believers, and even to many unbelievers, it is the sense that in the Gospels they have met a personality. There are characters whom we know to be historical, but of whom we do not feel that we have any personal knowledge by acquaintance. Such are Alexander, Attila, or William of Orange. There are others who make no claim to historical reality, but whom, nonetheless, we know as we know real people. Falstaff, Uncle Toby, Mr. Pickwick. But there are only three characters who, claiming the first sort of reality, also actually have the second. And surely everyone knows who they are. Plato's Socrates, the Jesus of the Gospels, and Boswell's Johnson. Our acquaintance with them shows itself in a dozen ways. When we look into the apocryphal Gospels, we find ourselves constantly saying of this or that Logion, "No, it's a fine saying, but not his. That wasn't how he talked." Just as we do with all pseudo-Johnsoniana. We are not in the least perturbed by the contrasts within each character. The union in Socrates of silly and scabrous titters about Greek pederasty, with the highest mystical fervour and the homeliest good sense. In Johnson, of profound gravity and melancholy, with that love of fun and nonsense which Boswell never understood, though Fanny Burney did. In Jesus, of peasant shrewdness, intolerable severity, and irresistible tenderness. So strong is the flavour of the personality that, even while he says things which, on any other assumption than that of divine incarnation in the fullest sense, would be appallingly arrogant, yet we, and many unbelievers too, accept him at his own valuation when he says, "I am meek and lowly of heart." Even those passages in the New Testament which superficially and in intention are most concerned with the divine and least with the human nature bring us face to face with the personality. I am not sure that they don't do this more than any others. We beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of graciousness and reality, which we have looked upon and our hands have handled. What is gained by trying to evade or dissipate this shattering immediacy of personal contact by talk about that significance which the early Church found that it was impelled to attribute to the Master? This hits us in the face. Not what they were impelled to do, but what impelled them. I begin to fear that by personality Dr. Bultmann means what I should call impersonality, what you'd get in a dictionary of national biography article, or an obituary, or a Victorian Life and Letters of Yeshua Bar Yosef in 3 volumes with photographs. That, then, is my first bleat. These men ask me to believe that they can read between the lines of the old texts. The evidence is their obvious inability to read, in any sense worth discussing, the lines themselves. They claim to see fern seed and can't see an elephant 10 yards away in broad daylight. Now for my second bleat. All theology of the liberal type involves at some point, and often involves throughout, The claim that the real behavior and purpose and teaching of Christ came very rapidly to be misunderstood and misrepresented by his followers, and has been recovered or exhumed only by modern scholars. Now, long before I became interested in theology, I had met this kind of theory elsewhere. The tradition of Jowett still dominated the study of ancient philosophy when I was reading greats. One was brought up to believe that the real meaning of Plato had been misunderstood by Aristotle and wildly travestied by the Neoplatonists, only to be recovered by the moderns. When recovered, it turned out, most fortunately, that Plato had really all along been an English Hegelian, rather like T.H. Green. I have met it a third time in my own professional studies. Every week a clever undergraduate, every quarter a dull American don, discovers for the first time what some Shakespearean play really meant. But in this third instance I am a privileged person. The revolution in thought and sentiment which has occurred in my own lifetime is so great that I belong, mentally, to Shakespeare's world far more than to that of these recent interpreters. I feel it in my bones, I know beyond argument that most of their interpretations are merely impossible. They involve a way of looking at things which was not known in 1914, much less in the Jacobean period. This daily confirms my suspicion of the same approach to Plato or the New Testament. The idea that any man or writer should be opaque to those who lived in the same culture, spoke the same language, shared the same habitual imagery and unconscious assumptions, and yet be transparent to those who have none of these advantages, is, in my opinion, preposterous. There is an a priori improbability in it, which almost no argument and no evidence could counterbalance. Thirdly, I find in these theologians a constant use of the principle that the miraculous does not occur. Thus, any statement put into our Lord's mouth by the old texts, which, if he had really made it, would constitute a prediction of the future, is taken to have been put in after the occurrence which it seemed to predict. This is very sensible if we start by knowing that inspired prediction can never occur. Similarly, in general, the rejection as unhistorical of all passages which narrate miracles is sensible if we start by knowing that the miraculous in general never occurs. Now, I do not here want to discuss whether the miraculous is possible. I only want to point out that this is a purely philosophical question. Scholars, as scholars, speak on it with no more authority than anyone else. The canon, if miraculous unhistorical, is one they bring to their study of the texts, not one they have learned from it. If one is speaking of authority, the united authority of all the biblical critics in the world counts here for nothing. On this they speak simply as men obviously influenced by, and perhaps insufficiently critical of, the spirit of the age they grew up in. But my fourth bleat, which is also my loudest and longest, is still to come. All this sort of criticism attempts to reconstruct the genesis of the texts it studies, what vanished documents each author used, when and where he wrote, with what purpose, under what influences, the whole Sitz im Leben of the text. This is done with immense erudition and great ingenuity. At first sight it is very convincing. I think I should be convinced by it myself, but that I carry about with me a charm, the herb moly, against it. You must excuse me if I now speak for a while of myself. The value of what I say depends on its being first-hand evidence. What forearms me against all these reconstructions is the fact that I have seen it all from the other end of the stick. I have watched reviewers reconstructing the genesis of my own books in just this way. Until you come to be reviewed yourself, you would never believe how little of an ordinary review is taken up by criticism in the strict sense, by evaluation, praise, or censure of the book actually written. Most of it is taken up with imaginary histories of the process by which you wrote it. The very terms which the reviewers use in praising or dispraising often imply such a history. They praise a passage as spontaneous, and censure another as laboured. That is, they think they know that you wrote the one Carente Calamo and the other In Vita Minerva. What the value of such reconstructions is, I learned very early in my career. I had published a book of essays, and the one into which I had put most of my heart, the one I really cared about, and in which I discharged a keen enthusiasm, was on William Morris. And in almost the first review I was told that this was obviously the only one in the book in which I had felt no interest. And now don't mistake. The critic was, I now believe, quite right in thinking it the worst essay in the book. At least everyone agreed with him. Where he was totally wrong was in his imaginary history of the causes which produced its dullness. Well, this made me prick up my ears. Since then I have watched with some care similar imaginary histories both of my own books and of books by friends whose real history I knew. Reviewers, both friendly and hostile, will dash you off such histories with great confidence, will tell you what public events had directed the author's mind to this or that, what other authors had influenced him, what his overall intention was, what sort of audience he principally addressed, why and when he did everything. Now, I must first record my impression, then, distinct from it, what I can say with certainty. My impression is that in the whole of my experience not one of these guesses has on any one point been right, that the method shows a record of 100% failure. You would expect that by mere chance they would hit as often as they miss. But it is my impression that they do no such thing. I can't remember a single hit. But as I have not kept a careful record, my mere impression may be mistaken. What I think I can say with certainty is that they are usually wrong. And yet they would often sound, if you didn't know the truth, extremely convincing. Many reviewers said that the ring in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings was suggested by the atom bomb. What could be more plausible? Here is a book published when everyone was preoccupied by that sinister invention. Here in the centre of the book is a weapon which it seems madness to throw away, yet fatal to use. Yet, in fact, the chronology of the book's composition makes the theory impossible. Only the other week a reviewer said that a fairy tale by my friend Roger Lancelin Green was influenced by fairy tales of mine. Nothing could be more probable. I have an imaginary country with a beneficent lion in it, Green one with a beneficent tiger. Green and I can be proved to read one another's works, to be indeed in various ways closely associated. The case for an affiliation is far stronger than many which we accept as conclusive when dead authors are concerned. But it's all untrue, nevertheless. I know the genesis of that tiger and that lion, and they are quite independent. Now this surely ought to give us pause. The reconstruction of the history of a text, when the text is ancient, sounds very convincing. But one is, after all, sailing by dead reckoning. The results cannot be checked by fact. In order to decide how reliable the method is, what more could you ask for than to be shown an instance where the same method is at work and we have facts to check it by? Well, that is what I have done. And we find that when this check is available, the results are either always, or else nearly always, wrong. The assured results of modern scholarship as to the way in which an old book was written are assured, we may conclude, only because the men who knew the facts are dead and can't blow the gaff. The huge essays in my own field, which reconstruct the history of Piers Plowman or the Fairy Queen, are most unlikely to be anything but sheer illusions. Am I then venturing to compare every whipster who writes a review in a modern weekly with these great scholars who have devoted their whole lives to the detailed study of the New Testament? If the former are always wrong, does it follow that the latter must fare no better? There are two answers to this. First, while I respect the learning of the great biblical critics, I am not yet persuaded that their judgment is equally to be respected. But secondly, consider with what overwhelming advantages the mere reviewers start. They reconstruct the history of a book written by someone whose mother tongue is the same as theirs, a contemporary, educated like themselves, living in something like the same mental and spiritual climate. They have everything to help them. The superiority in judgment and diligence which you are going to attribute to the biblical critics will have to be almost superhuman if it is to offset the fact that they are everywhere faced with customs, language, race characteristics, class characteristics, a religious background, habits of composition, and basic assumptions which no scholarship will ever enable any man now alive to know as surely and intimately and instinctively as the reviewer can know mine. And for the very same reason, remember, the biblical critics, whatever reconstructions they devise, can never be crudely proved wrong. St. Mark is dead. When they meet St. Peter, there will be more pressing matters to discuss. You may say, of course, that such reviewers are foolish insofar as they guess how a sort of book they never wrote themselves was written by another. They assume that you wrote a story as they would try to write a story. The fact that they would so try explains why they have not produced any stories. But are the biblical critics in this way much better off? Dr. Bultmann never wrote a gospel. Has the experience of his learned, specialized, and no doubt meritorious life really given him any power of seeing into the minds of those long-dead men who were caught up into what, on any view, must be regarded as the central religious experience of the whole human race? It is no incivility to say, he himself would admit, that he must in every way be divided from the evangelists by far more formidable barriers, spiritual as well as intellectual, than any that could exist between my reviewers and me. My picture of one layman's reaction, and I think it is not a rare one, would be incomplete without some account of the hopes he secretly cherishes and the naive reflections with which he sometimes keeps his spirits up. You must face the fact that he does not expect the present school of theological thought to be everlasting. He thinks, perhaps wishfully thinks, that the whole thing may blow over. I have learned in other fields of study how transitory the assured results of modern scholarship may be, how soon scholarship ceases to be modern. The confident treatment to which the New Testament is subjected is no longer applied to profane texts. There used to be English scholars who were prepared to cut up Henry VI between half a dozen authors and assign his share to each. We don't do that now. When I was a boy, one would have been laughed at for supposing there had been a real Homer. The disintegrators seemed to have triumphed forever. But Homer seems to be creeping back. Even the belief of the ancient Greeks that the Mycenaeans were their ancestors and spoke Greek has been surprisingly supported. We may, without disgrace, believe in a historical Arthur. Everywhere, except in theology, there has been a vigorous growth of skepticism about skepticism itself. We can't keep ourselves from murmuring, multa renascentur quae iam cecidere. Nor can a man of my age ever forget how suddenly and completely the idealist philosophy of his youth fell. MacTaggart, Green, Bosanquet, Bradley seemed enthroned forever. They went down as suddenly as the Bastille. And the interesting thing is that while I lived under that dynasty, I felt various difficulties and objections which I never dared to express. They were so frightfully obvious that I felt sure they must be mere misunderstandings. The great men could not have made such very elementary mistakes as those which my objections implied. But very similar objections, though put, no doubt, far more cogently than I could have put them, were among the criticisms which finally prevailed. They would now be the stock answers to English Hegelianism. If anyone present tonight has felt the same shy and tentative doubts about the great biblical critics, perhaps he need not feel quite certain that they are only his stupidity. They may have a future he little dreams of. We derive a little comfort, too, from our mathematical colleagues. When a critic reconstructs the genesis of a text, he usually has to use what may be called linked hypotheses. Thus, Bultmann says that Peter's confession is an Easter story projected backward into Jesus' lifetime. The first hypothesis is that Peter made no such confession. Then, granting that, there is a second hypothesis as to how the false story of his having done so might have grown up. Now let us suppose, what I am far from granting, that the first hypothesis has a probability of 90%. Let us assume that the second hypothesis also has a probability of 90%. But the two together don't still have 90%, for the second comes in only on the assumption of the first. You have not A plus B, you have a complex AB, and the mathematicians tell me that AB has only an 81% probability. I'm not good enough at arithmetic to work it out, but you see that if, In a complex reconstruction, you go on thus superinducing hypothesis on hypothesis, you will in the end get a complex in which, though each hypothesis by itself has, in a sense, a high probability, the whole has almost none. You must not, however, paint the picture too black. We are not fundamentalists. We think that different elements in this sort of theology have different degrees of strength. The nearer it sticks to mere textual criticism of the old sort, Lachmann's sort, the more we are disposed to believe in it. And of course we agree that passages almost verbally identical cannot be independent. It is as we glide away from this into reconstructions of a subtler and more ambitious kind that our faith in the method wavers, and our faith in Christianity is proportionately corroborated. The sort of statement that arouses our deepest skepticism is the statement that something in a gospel cannot be historical because it shows a theology or an ecclesiology too developed for so early a date. For this implies that we know, first of all, that there was any development in the matter, and secondly, how quickly it proceeded. It even implies an extraordinary homogeneity and continuity of development, implicitly denies that anyone could greatly have anticipated anyone else. This seems to involve knowing about a number of long-dead people, for the early Christians were, after all, people, things of which I believe few of us could have given an accurate account if we had lived among them. All the forward and backward surge of discussion, preaching, and individual religious experience. I could not speak with similar confidence about the circle I have chiefly lived in myself. I could not describe the history even of my own thought as confidently as these men describe the history of the early Church's mind, and I am perfectly certain no one else could. Suppose a future scholar knew that I abandoned Christianity in my teens, and that, also in my teens, I went to an atheist tutor. Would not this seem far better evidence than most of what we have about the development of Christian theology in the first 2 centuries? Would he not conclude that my apostasy was due to the tutor, and then reject as backward projection any story which represented me as an atheist before I went to that tutor? Yet he would be wrong. I am sorry to have become once more autobiographical, but reflection on the extreme improbability of his own life by historical standards seems to me a profitable exercise for everyone. It encourages a due agnosticism. For agnosticism is, in a sense, what I am preaching. I do not wish to reduce the skeptical element in your minds. I am only suggesting that it need not be reserved exclusively for the New Testament and the creeds. Try doubting something else. Such skepticism might, I think, begin at the very beginning with the thought which underlies the whole demythology of our time. It was put long ago by Tyrrell. As man progresses, he revolts against earlier and inadequate expressions of the religious idea. Taken literally and not symbolically, they do not meet his need. And as long as he demands to picture to himself distinctly the term and satisfaction of that need, he is doomed to doubt, for his picturings will necessarily be drawn from the world of his present experience. In one way, of course, Tyrrell was saying nothing new. The negative theology of Pseudo-Dionysus had said as much, but it drew no such conclusions as Tyrrell. Perhaps this is because the older tradition found our conceptions inadequate to God, whereas Tyrrell finds it inadequate to the religious idea. He doesn't say whose idea, but I am afraid he means man's idea. We, being men, know what we think, and we find the doctrines of the resurrection, the ascension, and the second coming inadequate to our thoughts. But supposing these things were the expressions of God's thought, it might still be true that, taken literally and not symbolically, they are inadequate, from which the conclusion commonly drawn is that they must be taken symbolically, not literally, that is, wholly symbolically. All the details are equally symbolic and analogical. But surely there is a flaw here. The argument runs like this. All the details are derived from our present experience, but the reality transcends our experience. Therefore all the details are wholly and equally symbolical. But suppose a dog were trying to form a conception of human life. All the details in its picture would be derived from canine experience. Therefore all that the dog imagined could, at best, be only analogically true of human life. The conclusion is false. If the dog visualized our scientific researches in terms of ratting, this would be analogical. But if it thought that eating could be predicated of humans only in an analogical sense, the dog would be wrong. In fact, if a dog could, per impossibile, be plunged for a day into human life, it would hardly be more surprised by hitherto unimagined differences than by hitherto unsuspected similarities. A reverent dog would be shocked. A modernist dog, mistrusting the whole experience, would ask to be taken to the vet. But the dog can't get into human life. Consequently, though it can be sure that its best ideas of human life are full of analogy and symbol, it could never point to any one detail and say, "This is entirely symbolic." You cannot know that everything in the representation of a thing is symbolical unless you have independent access to the thing and can compare it with the representation. Dr. Tyrrell can tell that the story of the Ascension is inadequate to his religious idea because he knows his own idea and can compare it with the story. But how if we are asking about a transcendent objective reality to which the story is our sole access? We know not. Oh, we know not. But then we must take our ignorance seriously. Of course, if taken literally and not symbolically means taken in terms of mere physics, then this story is not even a religious story. Motion away from the earth, which is what ascension physically means, would not in itself be an event of spiritual significance. Therefore, you argue, the spiritual reality can have nothing but an analogical connection with the story of an ascent. For the union of God with God and of man with God-man can have nothing to do with space. Who told you this? What you really mean is that we can't see how it could possibly have anything to do with it. That is quite a different proposition. When I know, as I am known, I shall be able to tell which parts of the story were purely symbolical and which, if any, were not. Shall see how the transcendent reality either excludes and repels locality, or how unimaginably it assimilates and loads it with significance. Had we not better wait? Such are the reactions of one bleating layman to modern theology. It is right you should hear them. You will not perhaps hear them very often again. Your parishioners will not often speak to you quite frankly. Once the layman was anxious to hide the fact that he believed so much less than the vicar. He now tends to hide the fact that he believes so much more. Missionary to the priests of one's own church is an embarrassing role, though I have a horrid feeling that if such mission work is not soon undertaken, the future history of the Church of England is likely to be short.